I'd like to speak to us this morning from the theme, Innocent Planet, Guilty People. Innocent Planet, Guilty People. And for our text, as was read earlier by Reg, we are using Isaiah chapter 53, verses 4 through 5 are the focus of the sermon this morning. Let me share with you just that verse. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. And by his bruises, we are healed. This passage in Isaiah has been called the passage of the suffering servant. We all want to know, who is this person that is absorbing on behalf of us all of this pain and all of this suffering? Now, the traditional Christian interpretation takes this passage and applies it straight to Jesus. But we have to remember, we have this book of Isaiah not from Christian literature. We have this book of Isaiah because of our Jewish brothers and sisters. This is the Hebrew Bible. That was the Bible for Jesus and the early church. And guess what? Some of us tend to forget, but Jesus was Jewish. And so this was his Bible. Isaiah was writing in the 7th century before this common era, 700 years before Jesus was born. And so out of due respect for the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish people, out of due respect for history, the first question we have to ask is, who did Isaiah have in mind when he wrote these words? And who did the Jewish people understand to be the suffering servant described in this powerful poetic passage? Who is the original suffering servant that Isaiah was writing about? Not the Christian appropriation of the motif for their interpretation of the death of Jesus, but who was that original suffering servant that Isaiah was writing about? The general scholarly consensus can be summarized as follows. In both of these texts, Yahweh, in both of the Isaiah passages, Yahweh, or God, sees the remnant, the left behind, the remnant of Israel, sees the remnant as the one receiving the punishment of exile. There was a massive invasion of ancient Israel, and the royalty and the people were carted off wholesale into Babylon. But there was a remnant, a small group of Jewish people left behind, and they would become the seed that would allow the people to be replenished and the land to be restored as the people of Israel. And so there was within Israel this faithful remnant. Some of them also went into exile. And the writer of Isaiah sees this faithful remnant as suffering on behalf of the sinful nation as a whole. And the problem is, this remnant suffers along with everyone else. All of the guilty people who had turned their back on God were still, the remnant who were faithful suffered along with them. And that's the key. The punishment, the exile, falls upon the innocent as well as the wicked. However, after the punishment is over, the faithful remnant will return to the land and become the holy seed so that Israel can experience a new birth in the land. So that's the traditional understanding of who this suffering servant is. It's not one person, but it is that narrow strand of faithful people within the larger mass of unfaithful people that will allow the country to return. Now, I don't want to continue an investigation, a new investigation into the identity of the suffering servant. I would, however, like to appropriate this motif of the suffering servant in a way that is relevant to our present moment, in a way that is relevant to the present moment of severe suffering that our world is experiencing. And I don't mean the pandemic, or I should say, I don't mean just the pandemic. I mean the whole world, the entire planet can be seen as the suffering servant. Let's listen to Isaiah's passage, but this time understanding our planet Earth as the innocent suffering servant, and we humans as the guilty beneficiaries. I'll reread the passage. Surely the earth has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted the earth as stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But the earth was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon the earth was the punishment that made us whole, and by the earth's bruises we are healed. Today is not Earth Day. No, this is October, not April. But what is becoming more and more clear is that we cannot afford to only think about the earth once a year. We have to think about it every day, because every day the earth is getting hotter. And the reason it's getting hotter is because of our human activity. That's why when I heard this passage, I thought immediately of how the earth has absorbed all of our transgressions. We pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, destroying the very atmosphere that gives us the oxygen we need to live. We are polluting our own air, and then we receive the punishment of that pollution. The earth is absorbing all of the oil and coal and all of the product of human activity, and then we wonder why it suffers. We wonder why the polar ice caps are melting. We wonder why the hurricanes are growing more and more frequent. We wonder why the rain is growing more and more less infrequent. We wonder why all the catastrophes are besetting us when it's the earth suffering and responding to our human behavior. By the earth's bruises, we are healed. We push our junk into the earth so that we don't have to look at it. But ultimately, that floating ocean of garbage, that floating island of garbage in the ocean will grow so big that we cannot look away. Just a few weeks ago, an oil pipeline under the Pacific Ocean right off the coast here in Orange County ruptured, and hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil polluted the ocean. I think it's still ruptured. They haven't fixed it or stopped it yet. We have to be concerned every day. We have to think about it every day, because every day our home, our earth, is becoming less hospitable to us. This month in Glasgow, Scotland, the Conference of Parties, COP26, will meet. This is the 26th time that the Conference of Parties have met since their first meeting in 1992. This series of meetings is what produced the Kyoto Protocols in 1997. This same annual meeting is what produced the Paris Agreement in 2015. And coming out of that Paris Agreement was one simple objective. Can I have the slide, please? That one simple objective declared a 1/2 degree of additional warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius would result in more frequent heat waves, flooding, and water shortages for tens of millions of people, a recent United Nations report says. And the New York Times noted, 1/2 degree may mean the difference between a world with coral reefs and Arctic summer sea ice and a world without them. If temperatures are allowed to rise by 2 degrees Celsius, crop yields will fall around the world, with sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central and South America being hit particularly hard. Thank you. It's not confined to the third world, although in many ways, not only is the earth suffering for our activity, our siblings in the third world are currently the suffering servant. Because it is to the third world that we ship our garbage and our plastic and our trash. It is from the third world that we extract the natural resources that we use and then dispose of there. The poor of this world absorb the excess, the harm, the punishments that we impose on them as the wealthiest nation the world has ever known. It's interesting that now many around the planet are concerned about a decline in population. There is negative population growth in much of Western and Northern Europe. The United States is barely holding on at replacement population growth. Thank you, Anna. But I'm old enough to remember when we were in a panic about a population explosion. But in the intervening years, what we've come to recognize is it's not that the planet cannot sustain 10 billion people. What we've come to understand is that the planet cannot sustain 10 billion Americans or people who live like Americans. We have to change our ways so that everyone can live sustainably. But our consumption is disproportionate to our population, and our production of CO2, it far outstrips our proportion of the population. And so we have to understand that this planet, this globe, is a home for all of us. And what we do here impacts everyone on the planet. So they suffer, but we suffer too. Just last week, the governor of California, Governor Newsom, expanded the California drought emergency from 50 counties to the entire state. But he did not order mandatory water conservation. Why didn't he order mandatory conservation? Because we're not ready to give up our convenience for our survival. He did authorize water regulators to ban wasteful water use. But it's still up to each of us to ban wasteful water use in our own lives, just as Adrian was sharing with the children. If they grow up with these water conserving measures, maybe their children will have a chance. But for them to have a chance, we have to change how we live. We each need to look at our water bill for October of 2021 and compare it to October of 2020 and see what contribution have we made to the reduction of water use. It's just that simple. Look at your water bill. Where are you? Are you using more than last year or less than last year? And if you're using more than last year, please go through your life, go through your home, and figure out how and where you can reduce your water consumption. If you are one of those who are using less, think about your life. What is it that's changed that allowed you to use less, and double down on those practices? We need to set goals for ourselves to reduce usage, or shortages will become regular and mandates will be imposed. President Biden's Build Back Better proposal offers incentives for clean and renewable energy and penalties for carbon-based non-renewable energy sources. Sounds reasonable. Sounds like a way and a path for us to move into a way of life that is sustainable. But there are those in our country and in our government who will put short-term comfort and profit over long-term sustainability for future generations. Now, we're all guilty. The planet is innocent, but we are a guilty people. We have succumbed to a variety of isms that do not have our interests at heart. We have succumbed to the consumerism that tells us that we ought to live a disposable life, that we need to use something, throw it away, and then consume something else, that the quantity of our consumption is a measure of our progress. That's what we've been taught. Materialism that teaches us that as we acquire more and more stuff, our lives are better and bigger. No, that's not the case. But understand that consumerism and materialism were never for you. Those are devices that serve not humanity, but predatory market capitalism, because it just wants you to keep on buying. Some folks say the solution to the container problem that is blocking all of our Christmas gifts from getting to the stores, the problem is we want too much stuff. It's a supply and demand problem. So there's another way to fix it. Stop demanding. Stop consuming. We don't need all that stuff. We need to decide whether we are going to be part of the suffering servant remnant, whether we are going to be that slim, narrow population of people who understand what we must do for the future to exist. We must decide whether we will volunteer to be the suffering servant or whether we're going to stand aside and watch others, mostly in the third world, suffer. Whether we are going to stand aside and watch others be wounded for our transgressions. We have to decide for ourselves, will we let our children be punished for our behaviors? So think about it in that 10th and 15th minute of your shower. The water that your children and grandchildren will not have. We still have a choice to save our planet. Our children might have a choice. Our grandchildren and great-grandchildren won't have a choice unless we do something about it today. Isaiah has described the suffering servant, the one who will do the right thing on behalf of the whole, the one who will make the sacrifice in order that the whole might be saved. I invite you to be part of the suffering servant, to serve this world, to be the leadership that brings us to environmental sanity so that our great-grandchildren will have a chance at life. Let the people of God say.